The moment the whispers turned into a full-blown storm, the royal corridors went silent because suddenly a claim that had been quietly simmering for years exploded into the open. A claim so bold it threatened to crack the carefully polished image of the monarchy itself. And at the center of it all stood one man who rarely makes headlines, Prince Edward, suddenly forced into the spotlight after lawyers confirmed something the palace had seemingly danced around for years. Something many believed was quietly being reserved for King Charles III. Something tied directly to the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Because when the news broke on February 3rd, the reaction across royal watchers, commentators, and even palace insiders was immediate. Shock, confusion, and a wave of uncomfortable questions. Had the public been misled about who would ultimately control one of the most valuable and symbolic royal inheritances?
Also in the UK, King Charles III has made his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh. The title was last held by their father, Prince Philip, from 1947 until his death in 2021.
The timing alone raised eyebrows. The announcement didn't come quietly through a ceremonial statement or a gentle palace briefing. It arrived as a direct rebuttal, a response to fresh accusations circulating through a high-profile podcast hosted by Meghan Markle. Accusations suggesting that Edward had been pushed aside quietly denied the inheritance many believed was his birthright. And suddenly, the palace narrative that had seemed so stable for years began to wobble. But Edward's response wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. And that might have made it even more explosive. Instead of anger or personal attacks, his statement came wrapped in something far more dangerous for gossip narratives: legal precision, documents, trustees, lease structures, governance rules. Words that don't sound dramatic at first, but inside the royal ecosystem, they carry enormous weight, because what Edward essentially revealed was that the entire public conversation around royal inheritance had been built on a misunderstanding, or worse, a convenient illusion. For months, rumors had swirled that royal assets connected to the late Queen and Prince Philip were essentially sitting like a giant treasure chest waiting to be divided. Commentators speculated about fortunes worth tens of millions. Headlines suggested certain heirs could simply sell estates, liquidate heirlooms, and convert history into instant wealth. It made for sensational stories, but Edward's clarification tore straight through that fantasy. The centerpiece of the controversy was a place that many outside Britain had barely heard of before the debate exploded: Bagshot Park. Bagshot Park isn't just another royal residence, it's a sprawling 120-room mansion surrounded by more than 50 acres of land tucked quietly within royal estate boundaries. For years, its ownership structure had been described in vague terms, leaving space for speculation. Some assumed it belonged directly to the monarch. Others believed it could eventually be sold by whichever royal inherited it. But Edward's lawyers laid out a completely different reality. Bagshot Park is governed by a 150-year lease agreement, a structure that sounds simple until you realize what it actually means. It isn't freehold property. It isn't a palace someone can simply sell on the open market. Instead, it's a long-term leasehold arrangement tied to strict contractual conditions and oversight connected to the Crown estate. In other words, even though the property carries an estimated market value often quoted around $30 million, that number is misleading. The leasehold rights can be transferred under certain conditions, but they are bound by covenants, restrictions, and governance obligations that make quick liquidation nearly impossible. And that's where the gossip narrative collided headfirst with reality, because suddenly the story wasn't about who owns the estate, it was about who stewards it. Edward emphasized that point repeatedly. What he inherited wasn't a fortune in the traditional sense. It was responsibility, a custodianship designed to preserve royal heritage rather than convert it into private cash. And that distinction changes everything. The roots of the arrangement stretch back years, long before the recent headlines. When Prince Philip passed away in April 2021, the first wave of succession discussions quietly began behind palace walls. When Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, those discussions intensified as the monarchy began reorganizing its internal structures. Then came March 10, 2023, the day Edward officially received the title Duke of Edinburgh, a title that carried far more significance than most people realized at the time. On the surface, it looked like a ceremonial gesture honoring Philip's legacy. Behind the scenes, it also confirmed Edward as the primary steward of several interconnected royal assets, including Bagshot Park and the global charitable ecosystem tied to Philip's life work. Park. And that ecosystem is massive. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, founded by Prince Philip decades earlier, now operates in roughly 140 countries and involves hundreds of thousands of young participants each year. But unlike a corporate empire, the award program doesn't exist to generate profit. It exists to support youth development, education, and leadership initiatives, which means its value isn't financial in the way gossip headlines love to calculate. It's reputational, institutional, programmatic, and that means Edward's role is closer to a trustee than a billionaire heir. But the moment those legal details surfaced, a new question emerged, a question that made the situation even more politically sensitive. If these assets were never meant to be monetized, why had so many public narratives suggested otherwise? Some observers pointed directly toward the cycle of accusations and counter-accusations that began during the now infamous 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey. That interview ignited a global firestorm around the monarchy, placing enormous pressure on royal relationships and public perception. Since then, every new allegation has been interpreted through the lens of that moment. And when Meghan's recent podcast comments revived the idea that royal heirs had been denied access to their rightful inheritance, the old tensions instantly resurfaced. But Edward's statement pushed back against that narrative with a very specific argument: the assets in question were never designed to function like personal wealth in the first place. They were structured deliberately to prevent exactly that. Trust agreements, non-disposal clauses, oversight by trustees and crown authorities. Each layer created a barrier against selling heritage assets to cover private debts or personal expenses. And that legal architecture, Edward suggested, was created long before the current controversy, precisely to protect dynastic property from short-term financial pressures. Even more intriguing were the reports that Edward wasn't acting alone in defending that structure. Sources close to palace operations indicated that Prince William had stepped in quietly behind the scenes to support the preservation-first approach. And insiders credited Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, with pushing strongly for governance solutions that prioritized continuity over sensational headlines. That alliance sent a clear signal inside royal circles. The monarchy was drawing a line. Royal heritage would remain exactly that: heritage, not collateral. But the deeper the story unfolded, the clearer it became that Edward's statement wasn't just about correcting a rumor. It was about resetting the entire conversation. Because if Bagshot Park couldn't be sold, if the Duke of Edinburgh's legacy programs weren't financial assets, if royal wills remained sealed for decades under British legal tradition, then the explosive inheritance story circulating in public discourse suddenly looked very different. Less like a fortune waiting to be divided, and more like a web of legal protections designed to make sure it never could be. And that realization opened an even bigger mystery. If the assets couldn't be liquidated, then why were so many people convinced they could? And who exactly benefited from keeping that illusion alive? The deeper investigators began digging into the situation, the stranger the entire inheritance controversy started to look. Because once the emotional accusations were stripped away, what remained wasn't a scandal about stolen wealth at all. It was a complicated legal fortress that had been quietly built around royal assets for decades. A fortress designed to stop anyone, even family members, from turning national heritage into personal cash. And that's exactly why the moment Prince Edward publicly clarified the situation, the ripple effect was immediate. Financial circles, royal observers, and even private lenders suddenly realized something crucial. The royal inheritance everyone had been arguing about was not a pile of liquid money waiting to be spent. It was a tightly controlled stewardship system. And the more experts examined it, the clearer the implications became. Because once Edward's legal team laid out the architecture behind Bagshot Park and the surrounding assets, one truth became impossible to ignore: the structure was intentionally designed to prevent exactly the scenario many commentators had been speculating about. The centerpiece remained Bagshot Park, that sprawling estate long rumored to be worth tens of millions. Headlines had treated the property like a jackpot waiting to be claimed, but the legal reality told a very different story. The estate sits under a 150-year leasehold structure, negotiated through private arrangements with strict contractual covenants attached. That means even though the estate carries an estimated market value, sometimes cited around $30 million, it is not equivalent to owning a freehold property that can be sold overnight. Leasehold rights come with conditions. Conditions tied to the Crown estate, to trustees, and to permitted usage rules that limit how the property can be transferred or monetized. In practical terms, it functions more like a stewardship contract than a personal asset, which is exactly why Edward's response focused heavily on governance language rather than emotion. By naming trustees, legal instruments, and stewardship obligations, he effectively dismantled the entire the royal estate narrative that had been circulating in public debate. debate. But that clarification triggered another chain reaction, this time in the financial world. Because once creditors and lenders realized the royal inheritance wasn't easily convertible into cash, the strategy surrounding debt recovery changed overnight. When lenders believe a borrower has access to large assets, negotiations usually move quickly. Loans can be restructured, debts can be settled, assets can be liquidated if necessary. But when those assets turn out to be legally protected by trust arrangements and covenant restrictions, the situation becomes far more complicated. And that's where the controversy began colliding with the financial reality facing Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Because for months, public narratives had suggested that royal inheritance might eventually provide financial flexibility. The idea floated around media discussions that certain royal properties or assets could be monetized if necessary. But Edward's February 3rd clarification made one thing painfully clear to financial observers. Those assumptions were legally naive. In fact, many of the assets often mentioned in speculation were tied up in structures that make unilateral sale nearly impossible. Trust arrangements protect institutional programs like the Duke of Edinburgh's award. Leasehold structures limit property transfers. Crown-linked estates require oversight and approval from authorities before major changes can occur. That kind of architecture doesn't just slow down asset liquidation, it often stops it entirely, which is why Edward's calm legal explanation sent a subtle but powerful signal to creditors: the rumored royal collateral simply wasn't available. And creditors pay attention to signals like that. In the world of private finance, lenders operate using a fairly predictable toolkit when they believe repayment may be uncertain. They can seek charging orders against assets. They can pursue freezing injunctions to prevent asset transfers. They can demand disclosure about a borrower's financial position. And in extreme cases, they can initiate insolvency proceedings. But those tools work best when the debtor actually controls assets that can be seized or sold. When assets are locked behind trust structures or legal covenants, enforcement becomes slow, expensive, and uncertain. Courts must first determine the exact nature of the debtor's rights, whether they are owners, beneficiaries, leaseholders, or trustees. And in the case of royal property, those distinctions matter enormously, because trustees have fiduciary duties to protect the purpose of a trust. They cannot simply sell trust assets to cover one individual's private liabilities. If they did, they would be violating their legal obligations, which means even if creditors attempted to pursue those assets, they would encounter layers of resistance built directly into the legal framework. And that framework wasn't built recently. It evolved over generations to protect dynastic patrimony, ensuring that royal estates and institutional programs survive political shifts, financial pressures, and personal disputes. So when Edward emphasized stewardship instead of ownership, he wasn't just defending his position. He was reminding observers that the monarchy operates under a fundamentally different financial structure than ordinary wealthy families. Royal assets are not simply inherited, they are managed. And that distinction created a domino effect across financial negotiations. And that approach quietly shifted the momentum of the debate. Inside palace circles, the episode also elevated Edward's role in ways few had anticipated. For years, he had been seen as a quieter figure within the royal hierarchy, operating largely outside the glare of constant media attention. They are the quiet mechanisms that determine whether royal heritage remains protected for centuries or becomes vulnerable to short-term financial pressures. And in the wake of Edward's statement, the direction now appears unmistakably clear. The monarchy is preparing to defend its patrimony with every legal tool available. Because beneath the gossip, beneath the headlines, beneath the swirling accusations that continue to dominate public conversation, one truth has emerged from the controversy. The royal inheritance everyone believed could be sold was never designed to be sold at all.